So many of us think the problems that we're dealing with are unique to us. But the reality is, about 100 billion people have lived before us. Millions of them have written books, and thousands of those books detail somebody else overcoming the same problem that you're currently facing today. Life doesn't have to be so hard. For $20, you can buy a book that condenses decades of somebody else's lived experience and best life lessons, and you can read that in days. You can apply what you learn, and you can avoid pain and develop skills.
Today's guest is Nick Hutchison. Nick is the visionary force behind Book Thinkers, a thriving seven-figure marketing agency bridging authors and readers. In just over 7 years, he has cultivated a platform reaching over 1 million people monthly and hosted the top 2% global podcast. Book Thinkers Life-Changing Books, featuring interviews with renowned authors like Grant Cardone and Lewis Howes. Nick's platform and services have empowered countless authors to reach millions of readers, driving sustainable revenue growth. His services encompass video production, podcast bookings, the social media brand building, with a mission to inspire readers to take action. Nick authored Rise of the Reader, delving into mastering reading habits and applying newfound knowledge to unlock potential. Welcome, Nick.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited for this interview. So what is one of the most courageous things that you have done?
I think starting a business. When I was growing up, I always was a little rebellious. I wasn't the best student, and so I didn't think I'd be the best employee either. And I took a job going into my senior year of college, and I continued with that position for a couple of years once I graduated. But I always knew that I would be an entrepreneur. I always knew that I wanted to run my own business. And so I think one of the most courageous things that I've done was spend 4 or 5 years trying to figure that out. It was a long process. It cost me a lot of money and time, but I'm so happy that I am where I am today as a result of that effort.
That's absolutely brilliant. So what took you on your journey into personal growth industry?
Well, when I went into that internship, my boss at the time introduced me to the world of podcasting. And so I started to listen to a bunch of podcasts where a host would interview a series of guests, and those guests would talk about what they did to become successful.
Mm-hmm.
And I had about an hour commute each way to that internship every day of the week that summer. And so I listened to a lot of shows, and so many of those podcasters, when they were interviewing their guests, they would ask them about books. And I heard so many of the same names over and over and over again. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki and books like that. So I decided to go to my local bookstore and grab a couple of books, and the rest is history.
Like they say.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent. Yes. So tell me more about Book Thinkers. Tell me all about that. What's that about?
Well, it's my company. We help authors promote and market their books. I have 10 people on my team. We serve hundreds of authors a year, and we do that through social media marketing, by placing them on podcasts to talk about their books, as well as helping them create video content for social media, because I think that's the fastest way to grow. So I love my business. I get to help authors put their books in the right hands, and those readers get to improve their lives with these books. So yeah, I love personal development. I love working in the industry. I think it's such a great place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially now of all time, everyone wants to improve themselves, improve their lives. If you don't do anything other than improve your life by reading a book, it doesn't even cost that much these days. Just buy a book, read it, implement it. So yeah, I know there's a lot of courses you can buy, but these days books are the way forward. Absolutely.
Oh yeah, 1000%. I mean, here's an example. I read a book called $100 Million Offers last year. It's a $20 book. It only took me a few hours to read and implement,
Wow.
and it generated an additional 6 figures of revenue for my business within a couple of months. So talk about
Wow.
ROI, return on investment. A few, $20 in a few hours of my time generated over $100,000 for my business in a handful of months. That's hard to beat.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Your podcast book, Thinkers, Life Changing Books, features interviews with renowned authors like Grant Cardone and Lewis Howes, just to name a few. What's one of your favorite interviews you've done, if you can actually pick one?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of favorites.
Yeah.
One that I did earlier
Mm.
this year. There's an author named Stephen Pressfield. He wrote a number of books, including The War of Art, which sold millions of copies. And he's an older guy. I think I think he's early 80s now.
Okay.
But he didn't become successful until I think he was in his mid 50s. And
Mhm.
so, it's a great kind of lesson for me to learn. I'm 29 years old. Like, he worked at his craft for almost 30 years straight without earning any money before he saw success. Yet my
Wow.
generation, they we look for instant gratification and overnight success, and we get mad when it doesn't happen yesterday. And like, I think one of the reasons that I love that interview so much is because it just kind of grounded me. It's like, okay, it takes a long time to build
Mm.
something successful. And he's just such a great, kind human being. I really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And like you say, absolutely, everybody wants everything yesterday, overnight. Life is fast paced. And then we have to remember it's not always like that. You've got to do the grafting, you've got to craft your field, whatever it is you want to do. It takes time. And that's where people get disappointed because the expectations are so high sometimes.
Yeah, I think so too.
Mm.
Social media doesn't really help with that, does it?
No, not at all. Especially youngsters. Everybody wants to be on social media and become a sensation overnight. It's not going to happen.
I know. It does happen, but it's like one out of a million people. And so you forget that the other 999,000, whatever the math is, you forget that those people don't make it, which is unfortunate.
Absolutely. So I'm excited to ask you about your new book, Rise of the Reader. Tell me more about your book, Nick.
Well, over the years of building my community, I've had hundreds of people reach out to me
Uh-huh.
and say, "Hey, Nick, I have a question." And then they'd ask their question. And so many of those questions were very similar. How do I choose the right books? How do I schedule reading time? How much should I read per year? How do I take effective notes? Should I be reading faster? How do I
Mhm.
implement the information that I learn? Create better action. And so, of course, I answer everybody. Like, I am of service to my community. I love answering questions, but I felt like there was more to the puzzle. And
Mhm.
I decided to write a book on answering all of those frequently asked questions, but also just sharing some of my more complex strategies for implementing the books that we read, because I've used these books to create health, wealth, and happiness in my life in a short
Mhm.
period of time. And I believe everybody has the ability to do the same thing, right? These books are accessible. We talked about it before. They're pretty inexpensive compared to other ways of learning. Certainly, 1/1000th of the cost of a college education.
Yes.
And so why spend 1,000 times more to get a lot less? So yeah, I believe in the power of personal development books. I believe
Mhm.
in these books more than almost everything, almost anything else. And I just want to spread that power to everybody else. So yeah, I decided to write Rise of the Reader, and the subtitle is Strategies for Mastering Your Reading
Mhm.
Habits and Applying What You Learn. I'm all about getting the most out of these books, implementing as much as I can, taking action, because action is the real measure of intelligence.
Yeah.
And I believe that. So, yeah, that's why I decided to write it.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic, especially myself being dyslexic. I am a slow reader, but saying that, I tripled my reading speed by taking a speed reading course. And yeah, it was brilliant. So I'm probably nowhere as near as you. How many books a day do you read?
Well, right now, I read about 100 books a year.
Hmm.
So I'm probably reading about two per week on average.
Wow. And that.
And I do a lot of, out of that number, 70 to 75 of them are physical paper books. We could talk about why it's better to read physical paper books than listen to audiobooks in a minute. But, the other 25 are audiobooks. I think there's some value to audiobooks. I'm not the biggest fan, just
Mhm.
like from a retention perspective. But yeah, I complete about 100 books a year.
Wow. See, for me, being dyslexic, I prefer to have the physical book, tangible, as well as listen to the audio at the same time. That's what I find works for me. I'm more likely to retain the information. So you tell me more about what you think, please.
Well, I think that's the best scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But, for anybody that's listening today that only listens to books, I'll say this: 80% of the inputs to our brain are visual.
Ah.
80%, which means that the other senses, they only make up the remaining 20%. So by default, if you're only listening to information, you're far less likely to strengthen that neural connection and retain it. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're reading it, you can cement the information a little bit faster. Now, if you're reading and listening to it, which is a tip that I give in my book, then I think you're even better off. So I love exactly what you're recommending and what you do. I think it's multi-sensory. It's the best way to get that information into your brain.
Oh, that's fantastic. And yes, that's a great tip. I mean, I thank you for sending your book to me. I've started reading it and I shall complete it for sure. So tell me, give me some of the habits we should be applying without giving
Yeah,
too much
some
away from your book.
Oh yeah, no, of course.
Yeah.
So sometimes I meet people
Hmm.
and I'll ask them what they're reading and they'll tell me and then I'll say why. And they're like, "What do you mean why?" So, one of the things that I like to know is why I'm reading each book. I like to share
Hmm.
my goal with the book so that it can share the information that I need back with me. So, I set an intention for each book that I read that follows the SMART goal framework. So, SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, meaning it's realistic, relevant, which means you're emotionally tied to it, and time bound. So there's a book that a lot of people are reading in the business world right now called $100 Million Leads.
Hmm.
Excellent book. But they're just reading it aimlessly, hoping that it's going to change their life. Instead, I say let's create a SMART goal for the book. Something like find and implement at least 2 lead generation strategies for my business by the end of the month.
Hmm.
That is specific, it's measurable. I know whether or not the book achieved its goal by the time I'm finished with it. That's attainable. I didn't say make $100 million. I just said find and implement 2 things. It's relevant to my business, so I'm emotionally connected to it because better leads equals more money. And frankly, we
Hmm.
kind of stink at lead generation. And then it's time bound. I said by the end of the month. So I'm going to write that intention on the inside cover of the book. And I'm going to reread that intention every time I read a few more pages so that my brain can filter for those actions to take. I think that's step number one is we really need to be intentional about the books we're reading. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Absolutely. That's
Good.
really great. Yeah. Do carry on.
Yeah, well, and then as you're reading, I think another important thing is to realize that not every potential action that you can take is created equal. So
Mm.
let's say I read that book, $100 Million Leads. Again, I'm trying to generate better lead generation strategies for my business. By the time I'm done reading, I have 15 notes, like 15 potential actions that I can take. Instead of trying to implement all 15, remember my goal is just to find and implement at least 2 or 3 things. So I'm going to look at that list and I'm going to say what 20% of these actions can lead to 80% of the change that I'm looking to make. Because again, not every potential action is created equal. 20% of these are probably worth more than the other 80%. So
Mm.
those are the ones that I want to implement. And so that's how I start to be a little bit, I try to be a little bit more decisive, limiting. And I get so much more out of the books that way.
That's brilliant. And one thing I must say, because you do talk about how to read effectively and take notes. That's one thing I struggle with is how to take effective notes. I'm reading, I'm not a great writer, but how would you take notes that are actually going to make sense to you afterwards?
Yeah, there's no right way to do this, but I'll share with you my process and some of the things that I find valuable. So, number one, reading and note taking are two completely separate activities, and we should try to avoid multitasking. A lot of people, they're task switching between reading and notes and reading and notes and reading and notes. Here's what I like to do: review your intention. Remember, my intention for the book is find and implement at least 2 lead generation strategies that I can use in my business. Okay. As I'm reading, if I think I find one of those, I don't stop and reflect on it and rewrite it and take notes. I just mark it off like a little star. Maybe I'll highlight it, circle the page number so that I can come back to it later, so that I can continue reading. You don't want to lose that momentum. Task switching is inefficient. Multitasking doesn't work. And so then once I'm done with the book, then I'll go back through separately once I'm done, and I'll look at all of those pages that I circled or highlighted or starred. And then I'll think about that takeaway. I'll reread it. Repetition, so rereading something, repetition leads to retention. So read the book all the way through and then go back and look at each one of those takeaways that you highlighted or circled and then rewrite them into a notebook. That's what I like to do. I just copy it over. So if the lead generation strategy is leverage Google paid ads or something, and here's why. I'll write that out. I'll just write like it says in the book. And then I'll look at that list of maybe 15 takeaways. And then I'll go through that process of which ones are most important for me. So, I mean, my note taking, I think number one, it's separate from reading. That's a really important thing. And then number two, just rewrite everything exactly how it is in the book, because that's another form of repetition, and repetition leads to retention.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've never thought of doing it like that.
Yeah, you'll have to try it out and let me know what you think.
Yeah, definitely. Because I try. No wonder it takes me so long to read books now. I can understand why. Okay, that's
Yeah,
brilliant.
it's if you just read all the way through and then go back and review your notes, that will actually take less time than reading and taking notes at the same time. It's kind of funny to think about, but I've tested that so many times, and I think that everybody should try it out. They're totally separate activities. I don't know why everybody bunches them into one thing.
Yeah, and you don't even need to write them because if you've highlighted them, they're there.
They are there. Yeah. Now, I think you should rewrite them because
Okay.
that's a form of repetition, and repetition leads to retention. There's something about taking notes that helps you understand the information a little bit more. But yeah, like you said, I think highlighting them in the first place, that's a really important thing to do.
That's brilliant because I wouldn't have thought of that at all. So that's absolutely brilliant. I'm loving everything about this. So, what
Good.
other tips, resources do you recommend, daily tips to anyone that wants to start becoming a rising reader?
Even earlier in the process, sometimes I meet people that tell me that they can't read. And I like to ask them, if I paid you $10,000 to read a book by the end of the month, do you think you could do it? And that same person is like, well, I could read 5. So it's not a question of whether or not we can read, but it's a question of whether or not we value it enough to prioritize it in our calendars. And like I mentioned with that book, $100 million offers, that I read, and I made over $100,000 from implementing the book in a couple of months. That's what I see when I look at these books, right? I see money, I see health, I see happiness, I see better relationships, I see a reason to read them. Books solve problems, or they develop skill sets, at least in the world of personal development. And so that's always what I'm looking for. I'm trying to remove pain, or I'm trying to get closer to the person I know I can become, like live up to my potential. Check out this math. If you read for 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening, that's 30 minutes a day. For somebody who's just starting out, now, I love that you read and you're dyslexic. I don't know if this is going to be true for people that suffer with dyslexia, but
Okay.
for the beginning reader, 30 minutes a day is about 20 pages. 20 pages 5 days a week is 100 pages a week. Remember, we're only reading for 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening by replacing some social media and some Netflix, let's say.
Yes, definitely.
100 pages a week is a new book every 2.5 weeks. That's 20
Wow.
to 26 books a year. simply by reading for 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening. So it doesn't have to be this all-consuming thing. And let's take it even a step further than that. Let's say you only read for 15 minutes in the evening before you go to bed. That's still 12 books a year. So I think sometimes we think, oh, it takes all this time, it's impossible. No, it's not. It just takes a little bit of effort. Little bit of effort, that's all.
And I think that's doable. I mean, I'd read longer than that. And I must admit, I'll share with you, I read my first book cover to cover at the age of 35.
I was 21, so, but listen, all credit to you, because most people, they choose not to ever read another book again.
No, I read a lot of books now. So you're saying in the morning and in the evening. I've heard different people say different things about reading in the evening. You don't retain it because you're tired. You wouldn't read anything that's anything too heavy. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with it.
Mm-hmm.
I try to read when my energy is at its peak, because it's important to me. In the morning, I go outside, I walk my dog, I get some sunlight. Then I go to the gym, I get the exercise endorphins flowing a little bit, which bring me energy. Then I go home, shower, change, have my first cup of coffee. And by then I have my exercise endorphins and my coffee, my cognitive enhancer. And I'm at my peak state of energy because it's like mid-morning. And so it's impossible for me to fall asleep at that point. Right? And that's when I do my reading, because it's so valuable to me in my life, in my business, in my relationships, in my health, my happiness, that I want to match my reading with my best energy. So you're right. Like, if you're tired and it's at the end of the day, your willpower is depleted and you're falling asleep and you're bad lighting, you're not going to get anything from that book. I've heard it said this way: even the best cup of coffee in the world tastes bitter if you're in a bitter mood. Right? So even the best book in the world, it's not going to seem great if you're tired, strung out, falling asleep, irritated, with no willpower. Like, that's not a good time to read.
No, absolutely not. So the thing being, $1 million question now, what's one of your favorite books other than yours, obviously?
No, mine. It's my only favorite book. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Listen, I've read 500 of these. I have so many different favorites in different genres and different areas of business and life and stuff. So maybe I'll kick the question back to you and I'll ask, maybe you could give me some different subjects and then I'll share my favorite book within each subject or something like that.
Okay, let's start with relationships.
I just read a great book called Relationship Grit by Catherine Gordon. And Catherine and John Gordon, they're kind of like a power couple. John Gordon has written a lot of best-selling books like The Energy Bus, and his wife, Catherine, worked with him on this book, Relationship Grit. And so, yeah, really interesting book. They went through some infidelity, and then they talked about how they built that relationship back and strengthened it, and some of the common mistakes that couples make. So that one's a little bit more about like romantic relationships, but a really good book.
That sounds excellent. And how about health? Everybody wants to get healthy these days. There's so much in the media about it, and nobody wants to be sick, let's face it.
Yeah, I have so many recommendations here too. I'll throw one out that I think is maybe a little bit different. It's called Lifespan by Dr. David Sinclair, and it's about longevity. I think the subtitle is Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to. And so, for me, it's about preserving my energy, from preventing disease to letting my body repair itself through fasting, supplementation, all sorts of things like that you can learn in that book, Lifespan.
That's brilliant. Yes. So when it comes to self-development, I know that's a broad subject. To help yourself understand yourself better, what would you say there?
I think a great place to start for just general self-development is The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. It's a very simple book about 4 things that you could start to tell yourself, 4 lifestyle choices that you can start to make that will improve your life. So I won't spoil any of them, but it's a really, really, really good book.
Excellent. I mean, is there anything else that you can think of just to cover all bases?
Sure. For personal finance and investing, I recommend a book titled I Will Teach You to Be Rich by Ramit Sethi. It's a really good book.
I love him.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
For entrepreneurship, like building your own business, I recommend 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. It's a really good book. For, let's see, what other areas for mindfulness, just kind of like improving your headspace. I actually recommend a book called Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. It's a really tough read, but I think when you can compare yourself to somebody else that's gone through some pretty difficult times, it can bring ease to your own mind. And so, yeah, he'll kick you in the butt. He'll motivate you. It's kind of like a mindset book too, but I think it also creates some mindfulness in your life. So those are some recommendations for everybody.
That's excellent. And yeah, definitely everybody do go out and get Nick's book. So Nick, where can the listeners find you online, your books, your podcast, what's your website?
Yeah, if anybody wants a custom book recommendation from me, it's one of my favorite things to do. So you can just DM me at Book Thinkers on Instagram, just Book Thinkers, that's spelled just like it sounds. And tell me about a problem you have. Tell me about a skill that you want to develop, and I'll provide you a book recommendation. And then from there, you can check out the links in our bio and find everything else that we have going on. I'll add one more thing, which is that so many of us think the problems that we're dealing with are unique to us. But the reality is about 100 billion people have lived before us. Millions of them have written books, and thousands of those books detail somebody else overcoming the same problem that you're currently facing today. So my message would be, life doesn't have to be so hard. For $20, you can buy a book that condenses decades of somebody else's lived experience and best life lessons, and you can read that in days.
Wow.
You can apply what you learn, and you can avoid pain and develop skills. So I just want to leave everybody with that. Like, I really want to make sure that I don't end up regretting not having done more in my own life. And a really important piece of that for me is making sure that I'm always investing in personal development.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I live my life with no regrets, no guilt. Absolutely.
Good. I love that.
Thank you for sharing your insightful wisdom and knowledge with us today. And by doing so, I know you've helped so many others. Nick Hutchison.
Thank you.
My final question to you is, because we are all about Create the Courage to Be Fearless podcast, what is your definition of courage?
Action. I think it's action. Just one word, action. Because I've noticed in my own life that like courage is acting in the face of fear anyway, right? It's acting, it's action. It's not living without fear, it's acting despite the fact that there's fear. And so action, you just have to act.